So in this unit, we are going to, we sort of could split this almost into two subtopics. So we're going to start by talking about general ecology, the science of living things and how they interact with their environment. And then in the second part of the unit, we'll get into what are some of the human impacts on our environment that we need to be aware of, that we can help to improve upon. So the science of ecology, this is what I studied in college, in grad school. My focus was in ecology. And in ecology, you study a variety of things. You study both living and non-living things. I took classes about trees and birds and wetlands. But also I took classes about geology and soil science. So you learn about both living things and non-living things. When you combine those, when you're studying ecology, how those things relate. So we have this concept of an ecosystem. An ecosystem is basically, like we said in our question today, an area where you have living things interacting with each other and with the surroundings, with the non-living things around them. And the scale of ecosystems varies. Some ecosystems are very large, like an entire ocean or desert ecosystem. Or you can have much smaller ecosystems. A rotten log could be considered its own ecosystem, or a puddle, or a courtyard in our school. Those are small ecosystems made of a variety of living things. They interact with each other, they interact with the surroundings. So we have a couple terms. When we're studying an ecosystem, we can talk about it and analyze the biotic factors of the ecosystem and also the abiotic factors. What does that prefix mean, bio?
Living.
Yeah, it means living. Biotic factors are the living components of an ecosystem. So if we imagine an ecosystem, the bacteria, the trees, the animals, the insects, the fungi, anything we learn about in our unit on taxonomy, that's part of the biotic factors within the ecosystem. And then we have the abiotic factors. You can probably guess what that means. Yeah, the non-living things. So what would examples be?
Rocks.
Rocks. What else? Ground, the soil, the soil itself, water, the air,
Sunlight.
all of that, sunlight, all of those things are they're not living organisms, but they're obviously an important part of the ecosystem. So if we look at this picture of a beautiful, diverse pond ecosystem, go ahead, list some biotic and abiotic factors. Sure.
No, it's not fawn. All right, give me some of your biotic factors. Who's got one you can give me? Jake? Raccoon.
The raccoon.
Colin?
Turtle.
Turtle. Diksha? So you only have two? Do you have another one that you could look at?
Deer.
A deer.
A froggy.
All right, you guys are giving me all one broad category. Give me something different to see it. Trees, okay.
A lily.
Sean?
Grass.
Grass.
A lily pad. Lily pad. I just had
Lily pad. All right, how about some things that you actually can't see that are still part of this ecosystem that are biotic factors? Ali? Yeah, there would be protists in that water. Good.
I think it's like baby boat.
Anything else? Tyler?
Lady
Yes? How about something we can't see? You just said it.
They were hard to see. Oh, bacteria.
Bacteria. Bacteria of fungi that are growing there. Yes. How about some abiotic factors?
Water.
The water. Ella? The air. I just,
The dead log.
the dead log.
The sun.
The sun. The temperature. The pH of the water. The acidity. The dissolved oxygen in the water. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. All of these things are non-living, but they're still important in this ecosystem. All right, you could have whatever. I don't care if you have those. All right. So when we study ecosystems, we often will talk about the biodiversity that's present in an ecosystem. And we might look at, within that ecosystem, specific populations of organisms. When we talk about a population within an ecosystem, we're referring to one single species in that ecosystem. So I might talk about the population of white-tailed deer in this ecosystem. Or the population of painted turtles. Would it be correct for me to say the population of fish?
No.
What makes that incorrect?
Because fish is a
Yeah, it's a broad category. It's many types of fish. I could say striped bass or something. Then I would be
Not even
referring to a
striped bass.
specific population.
school fish.
Sorry, not a fisherman.
Striped bass are not blue.
So all the bullfrogs in the pond would be an example.
That's not how that works.
Are you guys familiar with this term, biodiversity? What does it mean, Walker?
The amount of difference between each species.
Yeah, it's sort of how many different species are there. This ecosystem looks to have a large amount of biodiversity. There's many different types of living things there. What are some types of ecosystems maybe you're familiar with that you know have a very high biodiversity? Ella? The rainforest. Tropical rainforest is one of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet. It contains huge numbers of different types of living things. Ocean ecosystems as well.
Like on that sea, stuff be like the Arctic.
Yeah, maybe the Arctic or the desert would have lower biodiversity than some of those other ecosystems. So, when we examine an ecosystem, like I said earlier, we are looking at interactions, how different species interact with each other. And so, what we often will talk about is, well, what is the niche of white-tailed deer? And that word, what it means, it's sort of a hard word to define. We say niche in ecology, but you could pronounce it either way. It's basically sort of the role an organism plays. Like, what does it eat? When does it eat? Where does it mate? When does it eat? Those various descriptions about the organism make up its niche. And when we talk about
species, when we talk about the habitat, we're talking about where they physically live in the ecosystem. If we look back here at our ecosystem we're just looking at, if I'm talking about this white-tailed deer and I'm describing its niche, I might say, well, the white-tailed deer is an herbivore. It browses on plants and small woody shrubs, lives in the forest ecosystem, visits the water occasionally, mates in the springtime, gives birth in the springtime. And so all those sort of details about it make up its niche. Does anything else in this ecosystem have the same niche as this white-tailed deer?
No.
Probably not. What if it did? What if there was another species that ate the same foods in the same place at the same time? What would, yeah, they would be competing with each other. So when species are coexisting in an ecosystem, they often share a habitat, but if they also have the same niche, then there's going to be some competition. If there's limited resources, two species of the same niche will be competing to see which can actually get those resources. What happens to the loser in that battle? They might die out. They might have to find a different niche, a different way to survive in that ecosystem. Shift where they feed, for example. Find another part of the habitat where the dominating species is not. So they can, those niches can overlap. So this is actually my parents' house. These are the bushes around their house that they used to have. And yeah, this might look familiar. So why do these cedars look like this? What's happened up here versus down here?
Some white.
No? Drew?
The deer ate it.
The deer. So the deer that browse on these eastern cedars, they can only reach up so high. So everything above the height the deer can reach is growing and very lush. Everything below is browsed by the deer. So that's all about the deer's niche. That's about the deer's habitat. All right, so if we think about an ecosystem, what we often will trace is how energy moves. All ecosystems on the earth need a constant source of incoming energy. And what is that source?
The sun.
The sun. Without the sun, these ecosystems could not exist. Energy is a requirement for all living things. And in the Earth's ecosystems, it's the sun that is the source of that energy. Some organisms can capture that energy and use it directly. What do we call those types of organisms? Alex? That's what I'm asking. What do we call organisms that can directly use the sun's energy, Tyler?
They're autotroph. Not
Well,
autotrophic.
They may really like music, and we might call them audiotrophs, but
Was that close?
you were very close.
Very-
They're autotrophs, also called producers. Autotrophs can take energy from sunlight, use it in what process? Photosynthesis. And they use it to make food, glucose. They don't need to go out and eat anything else. They're getting their energy through photosynthesis. All other organisms cannot use the sun's energy directly. How do other organisms get energy?
They fight for it.
Not necessarily fight for it. They eat. They eat something. Sometimes they eat
producers, like me. Sometimes they eat other consumers. Depends on their niche. So consumers obtain their energy by eating other organisms. What's the technical term for a consumer? Heterotroph. We also have a class of organisms called decomposers. Decomposers are organisms that break down dead organisms and waste material and basically recycle the nutrients, the molecules and compounds in those dead organisms and waste, and return it back into the ecosystem. Most of the time we consider decomposers to be fungi and bacteria. For example, in the front part of my lawn, we used to have this big maple tree. Yeah, and what grows there every year? Mushrooms. They pop up every single year because they are decomposing the roots of where that tree once was. They're digesting that material, using it as a source of energy.
Why wouldn't Guinness flytraps be considered decomposers?
Because they still go through photosynthesis. So they still make their own food using photosynthesis, but they are just breaking down flies, for example, or insects to get nutrients like nitrogen or phosphorus. Because they typically grow in soil that's very poor. There's not a lot of nutrients in the soil, so they get those nutrients for capturing insects. But they're actually still using sunlight. They're still going through photosynthesis to get energy. So have you guys ever used food chains before?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Food chains and food web. All right, so, food chain shows basically in an ecosystem, it shows what we call the flow of energy. How does energy go from one organism to another to another? The area in which people get confused sometimes is in the direction of the arrows. The arrows, you can think of it as what's going into what's mouth. So when the hawk eats the mouse is going into the hawk's mouth. The arrow goes from the mouse to the hawk, showing where is the energy going. It illustrates what we call predator-prey relationships. So if I draw a very simple food web, you always start with what?
Smallest producer.
Not the smallest thing,
The lowest on the food.
not the sun. We don't usually include the sun because why don't we include the sun? It's not an organism. We include the organisms that do use the sun, which are plants, producers.
I said producers like
Things like, in our example, we'll start with a wheat plant. No, this is a different thing.
Oh.
So wheat, which might be eaten by a mouse, which might be eaten by a snake, which is then eaten by an eagle. And we have a food chain. Energy begins by being captured by the wheat plants and then goes through this series of transformation.
I have 4 of the largest birds in North America.
So when we label a food chain, you know that the producer is the autotroph. And then we often will label the other levels according to where in the food chain they are. We start with the first level consumer, and then this would be the second level consumer, and then the third level consumer. Sometimes the first level is called the primary consumer. It's the first thing that eats the producers. And we classify consumers by what sorts of organisms they eat. So I guess if you want to label this food chain on the bottom has 4 levels.
Produces.
Oh
wait, the squirrel died.
I can't read that. What is this?
That's
what
funny.
you feed
That's
us.
funny.
So nice of you.
That was
Eating
funny.
She's feeding the hawk.
She's feeding the squirrels.
All right. So with these terms, are these terms familiar to you?
Yes.
All right. So I can go
I
fast.
watched too many Discovery.
All right. Herbivores are organisms that eat only plants. They are first level consumers. I would be a first level consumer. Carnivores are second level or above. They eat only other animals. Most of you would be considered omnivores. All of you would be considered omnivores. Omnivores consume both plants and animals. When we talk about energy flow, we talk about predator-prey relationships. Predator being the hunter, prey being the food, the hunted. So we also have this term, the apex predator. These are the top level predators in an ecosystem that nothing else eats them. Talk about the golden eagle, top level apex predator. Nothing eats a golden eagle. Nothing eats a wolf. And nothing eats a lion. These are apex predators. So we already defined these words. Heterotrophs are those that cannot make food themselves. What's another term for a heterotroph?
Consumer.
Consumer. And autotroph is a
Producer.
producer.
Oh, I wish I could use my son to make food.
So a food chain shows us energy flow, but it's a very simplified version of what really is happening in an ecosystem. Typically, in most ecosystems, energy just doesn't go to one organism, which is eaten by another, which is eaten by another. Things are usually much more complex. And we could use what we call a food web to show a little bit more of that complexity. A food web shows many food chains interconnected, showing the multitude of feeding relationships that you typically have in an ecosystem. So this would be a pretty simple food web. We could look at it and we could identify several food chains, like wildflower, mouse, snake, hawk, or wildflower, rabbit, hawk. Those are two different food chains you could find within this food web. Is this a food chain or web?
Food chain.
Chain.
Question.
Yes.
Is there like a certain web that only contains like decomposers that just keep decomposing and never ends
No.
cycle of decomposition, thus ending the world?
No. All right, let me ask you a question.
What?
If we had, if you imagine this ecosystem, if we were to gather up all of the producers and then all the herbivores and carnivores and find the mass of each one all together, what do you think you would have the most of?
The producers.
Agree?
The small ones.
Is the size what's important?
No, the ones that only shred.
So, yeah, there would most likely, if you gathered up all the grass in an ecosystem and weighed it, it would weigh a lot. What would probably be second most?
The mice or the rabbits?
Yeah, the things that eat the grass. What would you find the least of?
The
Yes, the apex predators. This is a relationship that we see in all ecosystems. As you make your way up a food chain, there are less and less mass of those organisms. You always have the most energy in the producers. Okay. Let me go ahead to this. And we depict this showing what we call an energy pyramid. And there's a reason for this relationship, why we get fewer and fewer organisms as we move up the food chain. And it has to do with how organisms use energy. When one organism consumes another, all of that energy doesn't go into making it larger. Say you went to McDonald's and you ate 4 quarter pounders.
That's a
Or
whole pound.
a full pound of, maybe just ate, you're on like the keto diet, you just ate the beef part. So you ate 1 full pound of beef.
Oh, that's
Does that mean
that's bad.
that the next day or 2 days later, are you going to weigh 1 pound more?
No. Oh,
What happens to that pound of beef you ate?
it's absorbed and digested and pooped in.
Yeah, lots of things. So you use a lot of that energy to move around, to keep you alive, to breathe. Okay, some of it is indigestible. Only about 10% of the energy that's consumed by an organism actually makes it into growing bigger or larger. 90% of the energy is lost. So every step we go up a food chain, that process repeats. And energy is lost, 90% of the energy is lost as we move up the food chain. That means there's not a lot of energy available for those top-level carnivores. So the biomass is the term for the total mass of those organisms. Because only 10% makes it to the next level, we get less and less as we move up the food chain. And this probably makes sense. You don't see a school of sharks swimming through the ocean. You don't see a flocks of golden eagles flying through the skies.
People, you definitely do see sharks.
You
in
see
ponds.
sharks, but you don't see a school of hundreds of sharks swimming through the ocean like you would for some fish lower on the food chain.
Oh, that's
You don't see herds of lions moving through the savannah.
What you mean by herds, though?
You don't see herds of wolves migrating, but you do see huge herds of caribou. This is because there is not enough energy to support the highest level of the food chain. There's only relatively few of those organisms. So this just illustrates the same idea. Okay? We always, in an ecosystem, have the most producers and the least of the apex predators.